On behalf of the library's African and Middle Eastern Division, I am pleased to welcome you this evening to the relaunch of the division's signature webcast series, Conversations with African Poets and Writers. I am Dr. Edward Miner, head of the African section. For more than 60 years, the African section has served as the focal point for Africa-based research collections and services at the library. Within the division, it is one of three, including the Hebraic and Near East sections, that provide access to research collections of unmatched depth and breadth, documenting the literatures, cultures, and histories of regions extending from the southern tip of Africa to the Mediterranean coast, across the Middle East to Central Asia, and down to the Indian Ocean islands. The library holds rich collections in major African languages such as Hausa, Wolof, Arabic, Amharic, Tigrinya, Somali, Kiswahili, Malagasy, and Zulu, as well as hundreds of lesser-known languages. The African and Middle Eastern Division is pleased to relaunch the Conversation series with Ethiopian-American poet, painter, sculptor, translator, and art professor, Kabadach Tekleb. In conversation with the library's curator of Ethiopic collections, Mr. Fantahun Tiruna. Kabadach's first collection of poetry, Yetno, was published in Addis Ababa in 1990. In 2020, her work was included in the first anthology of Amharic poetry in English translation, Songs We Learned from Trees, an anthology of Ethiopian Amharic poetry edited by Chris Beckett and Alemu Tebeje. Most recently, Kabadach contributed to the anthology Soul Spaces, Poems on Cities, Towns, and Villages, published in January 2023. Her visual art has been on exhibition or permanent display in venues such as the Smithsonian Institution, the Holocaust Museum in Chicago, the Maritime Museum in Savannah, the Orlando Museum of Art, American University, Columbia University, the Navy Memorial Archives in Washington, D.C., the American Embassy in Addis Ababa, and the Ethiopian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Kabadach was born and raised in Addis Ababa. As a teenager, she was involved in the student movement protesting the military junta that brutally ruled the country. Because of her involvement, while still a teenager, she was forced to leave her birthplace and cross the Ethiopian border's harsh terrain to join the UN High Commission for Refugees in Djibouti. However, she was captured en route by Somali soldiers and was detained in Somalia for 10 years. After her repatriation, she joined her family in Washington, D.C., and enrolled at Howard University, where she earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in fine art. Kabadach is currently an associate professor of art at the City University of New York, Queensborough Community College. I'm pleased to give you Kabadach Tekleb and Mr. Fantahun Tiruna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miner, for this wonderful introduction. I'm going to start reading the first poem. The title is Cotton Life. This era of exile winds its spindle of raw cotton before the seed is removed and life bursts out. Before the cotton is combed, before it is robbed and made into thread, before it is woven into cloth, before its pattern is decided and its colors applied, before it is given a name, before it is worn as a garment, before it is put on as a cloak, before it is blessed, this age of exile spins without uncoiling, tangles without threading, and before its cattle life begins, it announces its end. In the above poem, Cattle Life, the visualization of the material, the process of weaving, and its symbolism in Ethiopian and Eritrean tradition became instrumental in delivering a metaphor that fits the wilting lives of refugees around the globe. There is no competition between words and images to alert me to the knowing. However, their manifestation in the concrete world is different. Visual art pertains to specific materials and techniques. In most cases, it is meant to be perceived through the eyes. As a script, the words belong to surfaces to be seen, but to be spoken or heard. Since I digressed from realism a few decades ago, my artwork tends to disregard recognizability as a figure and precise meaning, because both could be specific and territorial. By avoiding distinctive imagery, I aspire to make a statement applicable to a wide range of shared experiences. In my most recent works, I wanted to bring my paired devotions, a commitment to the art and poetry, on the same surface of the artworks, or in close proximity to each other in exhibition halls. It was essential to me to evaluate how I want to integrate scripts with my artwork, considering legibility or unreadability, since my art avoids specific connotations for the sake of more significant meaning. Occasionally, however, the presence of a keyword as part of the design element in the work might serve as a night star to gesture a stranded viewer to an open lane. In most cases, altering the intended vital function of a word, elucidating a concept, or assigning a different value and purpose to it creates a unique equation in my artwork. Therefore, by making it unreadable, a word becomes equal to a mark, a color, a texture, or a tone. Its value is not equal to specific meaning, but feeling, which is greater than its sum. Emotions are less didactic and open-ended. It is possible to imagine parallels of its kind in other types of fine art expressions, such as a narrative of movement in a choreography or a musical composition without lyrics, like the sound of a drum in rural Africa that alerts the villagers either to a birth of a child or a ballad, or a griots drum to a storytelling moment. There are also conditions in which I want to use the full capacity of a poem to stand as a relief with the structural angularity on the wall side by side with visual art to create a dialogue between art and poetry, like a call and response. Regarding this proximity, I want to paraphrase the words of David Keplinger, the curator of my recent solo show, Blue and Gray, This Era of Exile, in collaboration with the literary activist E. Ethelbert Miller on poetry. Dr. Keplinger discusses that the essence of the project is that one other part is always translating its partners in some way that the partner can't do for themselves. The poetry is translating for the arts in a way that the art can't do onto itself without words, and vice versa. The poetry is translating for the art in a way that the art can do onto itself without words, vice versa, I'm repeating. He was referring to the collaborative aspect of the show that brought the two different types of fine arts, the visual art and poetry, together in the same space. Moving away from figurative art to abstraction and later to non-objective art, I became more interested in investigating concepts. My professional life is focused on issues of in-betweenness for the most part. In between two-dimensional and three-dimensional, in between painting and sculpture, in between being an alien and a resident, in between languages, between being perfect and imperfect, between poetry and visual art, and many times in between borders. The precarious position of being in between holds a lot of wisdom, and the wisdom lies in the process of becoming. The actual process of bridging the gap between painting and sculpture in my practice occurred some 20 years ago. The phenomenal artist Sam Gilliam, who passed away recently, who happened to be my mentor, freed the canvas from the barricades of stretchers in the early 1960s. His contemporary Frank Stella in New York created minimalist sculptures that hold colors. I learned from what was before me and took a different approach regarding materiality, purpose, and influence. Time, space, and literature became subjects of exploration, a nonlinear time, layered folding and unfolding spaces, a literary tradition in Ethiopia that we call Kane, influenced my exploration of concepts of in-betweenness. I began exploring non-traditional art materials such as the silver mesh to bridge the gap between painting and sculpture, carrying the concept of time and memory. I had to create a technique and master the process to make it functional for my purpose. The first group of those pliable sculptures was exhibited at Howard University Gallery in early 2000. Among them, Flow of Time was dedicated to my mentor and professor, the late Iskender Bogosian, right after his death. Since then, the works have been evolving. For my recent solo exhibit at the American University Museum that took the global refugee crisis as its subject, colors set the subject's tone, texture merged as new elements, layers became expansive and more translucent, at times opaque, and materials unusual and eclectic. The visuals are created like the poems, responsive, less didactic, aesthetically tuned, and open-ended. The impact of sound in poetry, nature, or organized music is significant in my work. One of the earliest modernists, the Russian-born artist who grew up in current-day Ukraine's Odessa, Wesley Kandinsky, who was also an accomplished musician, once said, I quote, "Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the harmonies, the soul is the piano with many strings, the artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul," unquote. The Scottish artist Jim Lembey, a visual artist and musician, creates vast, colorfully rhythmic installations that are expressive and immersive at the same time. And he said, "You put a record on, and it's like all the edges disappear. You are in a psychological space. You don't sit there thinking about music. You are listening to the music. You are inside the space that the music is making it for you." For me, the sound of a poem is as powerful as the sound of music. Both music and poetry have substantial impacts on my artwork. Open-endedness inspires me more than directness. Subtlety excites me more than explicitness. Jalaluddin Rumi's poem, "I Am Part of the Lord," inspired one of my playable sculptures titled "Part of the Lord" in 2005. The work is permanently displayed at the American Embassy in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It is part of my earliest works using non-traditional art materials to bridge the gap between painting and sculpture. Rumi's imagination and expression of his affinity to the universe inspired the work. The weighted drape of the dark mesh that covers the floor is part of the colorful composition. The chromatic and achromatic broad membranes coexist as parts of the installation. Cassandra Wilson's rendition of "Strange Fruit," formerly sung by the great Billie Holiday, inspired my "Strange Fruit" painting in 1998. The jazz flutist and composer James Newton's musical compositions have been inspirational to me. Recently, his music, "At the Sound of Many Waters," inspired one of my non-objective pieces with the same title, "At the Sound of Many Waters." Whether through my earliest figurative work, abstract, non-objective, or the ones that explore in-betweenness as a significant part of my career, I explore the global human conditions through my work. My master's fine arts thesis, "Humanity in Descent: Visual Images of Human Suffering," 1995, looks into my 10 years of imprisonment in Somalia's concentration camps as a teenager during the Ethio-Somali War and the political turmoil in Ethiopia that forced me to flee my country. It also references how my experience relates to the global crisis of humanity. I created a substantial body of work about the Red Terror in Ethiopia, the issue of Native Americans, conflicts in the Middle East, slavery, the Holocaust, and other genocides such as in Rwanda. Most of these pieces were exhibited in institutions like the Museum of African Art, the Smithsonian. My painting, "The River in Rwanda," is permanently displayed at the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois. My book of poetry in Amharic, "Yet Now," which I wrote on peelings of medicine packages while I was in the concentration camps in Somalia, became the first window to look into the tragedy of that hidden place and the violations of the Geneva Conventions in the labor camps of Somalia. Since 2017, I have been researching the conditions of the refugee crisis, which includes that of the Mediterranean Sea and its coastlands. Many African refugees continue to lose their lives in the sea, among other refugees from other countries. Some suggest that the Africans should stay on the continent, taking shelter in refugee camps like the ones in Uganda's refugee settlement programs. I thought my research should begin from the continent. I took a research project to Uganda to learn about the programs, interviewing people who live in two refugee settlement camps, Nakivale and Bidibidi. These are the previous works from my thesis. Okay. At that time, there were more than 60,000 African refugees in Nakivale, most leaving their countries because of war and internal conflict. In Bidibidi, more than 70,000 Sudanese refugees fled their home because of the war. While Bidibidi was a young camp, refugees in Nakivale lived for several years in dire conditions. Life is stagnant in the center. For some, an active death is replaced by a slow death. Upon my return, I produced a body of work that was included. I produced a body of work that was included in an international show at the Maritime Museum in Savannah the following year, and many other museums and art centers in the state of, in other parts of the United States. It was during that time, when I was in Uganda, that I wrote the first poem that I read, Cotton Life. I wrote it in Imbarara, Uganda. Now I'm going to read the Amharic version for you. ጥጥድሜ ይህ የስደት ዘመን እንዝርት ያልተባዘተ ጥጥድሜ በላዩ ያጠነጥናል። ሕይወት ሳይፈለቀቅ ጥፍጥሬው ከውስጡ ሳይለቅ ጥንጥኔማ ሞልቷል ይላል። ሳይበዘት ሳይደወር ሳይሸመን ሳይቀመር ጥበብ ስሌቱ ሳይሰላ ህብረ ቀለሙ ሳይሰፍር ገና ስም ሳይሰጠው ሸማ ሆኖ ሳይለበስ ኩታ ሆኖ ሳይደረብ ቡራኬ ገና ሳይደርሰው ይህ የስደት ጥጥድሜ ሳይከር ይጠነጠናል። ሕይወት ገና ሳይሟሽ ግብአት ደረሰ ይለናል። My attempts to bring poetry and visual art together led me to translation. I am a writer in my native language, Amharinya, the national language of Ethiopia. Occasionally, I write in English when the subject that influences a particular poem is connected to the English language. Those poems sound like me. They have their own slant. One of such poems was inspired by a question to me from my late mentor, Sam Gilliam. The title is, You Asked How I Survived. I survived. As a baby fly might survive a fall. As a blown petal might survive the wind. As a young frog might survive the mud. As a young cricket might survive a miss of a tender lip, no more, no less. I survived because I stepped on my own steps and missed. Right, I think we can talk about the artwork just slightly. And this is one of the paintings that I created in 2018. The title is Non-Buoyant Life Vest. It's acrylic on mesh, one of the recent materials that I am using. I have been using that material actually for 20 years, but it evolved. And this specific quotation from the newspaper that I read actually dominated my thinking during that period of time. This was the time that I, returned from Uganda, interviewing people. So, tricked into death, 150,000 migrants' life jackets, many of which are useless fakes, lie piled on the coast of Lesbos, in green memorial to those who died crossing the Mediterranean coastlands. So it's hard to understand scale through pictures, so I included myself so that you can understand the scale of it. And this is another one with the same kind of refugee crisis. Crossing the title is the borders is the title, 2018 all the way to 2023. And this is a piece that was inspired by E. Ethelbert Miller's poem. I did two things with his poem. Number one, I translated his poem from Amharic into English. And secondly, it inspired me to create this piece as well. This is also another piece from that collection, The Lost Words, the mystery of words linked to identity and how identity was going to be lost, the minute we crossed, a foreign land, etc. This is a new material that I explored. As you see, it is a huge piece, acrylic on hardened acrylic, 2023. This is a detail of The Lost Words. I also did similar things with prints. This is a small scale woodcut that I produced in one of the residency programs that I was in. And this is an installation that I did using the prints, turning them onto three-dimensional formats. This is huge, actually. And 2019, this piece had been created previously in 2010, I guess, with the same kind of composition and materiality. And this is a redone of the first one. And the first one is collected by Juliette Bete, who's attending this lecture right now. And this is the same piece from the other side of it. Okay. And Fragmented Ties was created in 2018. I also wrote a poem about the thing that influenced me, which was ex-President Trump's decision to separate, young children from their parents at the Mexico-US border. And Fragmented Ties is the title. So I'm going to read the Amharic version of Ethelbert's poem. The original poem is entitled The Blue Years, and his audio is not working, and I chose not to read it because this is always better when the writer himself or herself, read the poem. So the translation is ሰማያዊ ህብረ ዓመታት እናም ወደ ውጭ ወጣን ዝናብ እንደ ዶፍ እየጣለ ህሊናችን ወደ ኋሊት በሐዘን እየቆሰለ ያቋረጥነውን ባህር እንደገና እየቀዘፍነው አእምሯችንን በስቃይ ፊታችንን በንባጠብነው ሕይወት የብካይ ጎርፍ ነው እኛም የተወለድነው በብሩህ ፍላጎትና በተስፋ መቁረጥ መሃል ነው በዚያ ቦታ ከዋይታችን ቀደም ብሎ በስደት ወደ ረገጥነው ሰማያዊ ህብረ ዓመታት የሚቀመስ ምግብና የውሃ ጠል የታጡበት ሰማያዊ ህብር ዓመታት ቁጥራቸው የበዛ ሰዎች በአየር ንፍገት የሞቱበት ይህ ነው የማይባል ጥማት ምላሶቻችን የታበሱት በሰማያዊ ቀለማት። Thank you very much.
Professor Kabadech Taklaab, I want to formally welcome you to the Conversation with African Poets and Writers Forum. Welcome. I want to express my deepest heartfelt happiness to have you as my guest to discuss your life in poetry and art. You and I have known each other for a long time, perhaps from early 1990s. And you were and are a good friend of my beloved wife, Marta Gazala. But I also want to remember the times that your beloved sister Almaz and your brothers were desperately looking for you all over the place, spreading the word that they had a lost sister and wanted to know her whereabouts. And that's when I was very much interested to know more about you from Marta, who used to be your schoolmate. The first question I would pose for you would be to share your thoughts and memory of your school days, the fine art school days, when you had your professors or teachers, art teachers, and schoolmates there. You're also, if you also touch upon how you got involved in the student movement, by the by, I would appreciate it. I think you have already mentioned Gabra Christos Desta and Skandar Bogosian in your poem. So if you also want to talk a little bit about them, I would appreciate it.
Is this working? Okay, thank you very much, Fantahun. Yes, this is this working? Oh, yeah. So this is a long time friendship that we have, my family, your family, etc. And you were one of the first people that I met traveling, from Ethiopia after my repatriation. And right before I joined Howard University, I met the family through Marta, actually. So it's a pleasure, to see everybody here. Yeah, so Addis Ababa Fine Arts School is fundamentally important in terms of producing all different generations of artists in Ethiopia. It was founded by Ala Falaga Salam, who passed away a few years ago, and single-handedly, actually, he established the school, and so many great artists, came out of that school. When I joined the art school, which was during the revolution, the school was primarily focusing on realism, and specifically socialist realism was something big, during that period of time. And that means a number of hours dedicated to studying how to depict the world as is. So that school was extremely excellent in the tradition of, visual arts that we call realism or representational artwork. And that that training actually helped me, made my life easier once I joined, Howard University as an undergraduate, student. So my professors, most of them studied in Russia and the other part of, socialist countries in Europe, and both philosophically and aesthetically, they were in tune to that kind of, tradition. To name some of them, Taddasa Belai and Taddasa Mammecha, and Warku Mammo, and who else? Taddasa Gzao, and recently we also lost the second director of the school, Abdurrahman Sharif, who taught me printmaking. So those professors, I don't think they got the praise and acknowledgement that they deserved, in spite of the great school that they laid. So that's my briefly my recollection of that school. In terms of being involved in the student movement, I was involved because number one, that was the sign of the time. Almost everybody, around my age was studying in a small circle that we call cells. We study the socialist literature, and the intensity was, even though we meet in a very secluded space and briefly and underground, the connection between us was extremely strong. And selfless generation, I would call that generation, because they sacrificed their lives, their progress, or good living in the future because of the cause that they believed in, which was to serve the society. Whether the end product was not, happening the way the dreamers dreamt it, but the sacrifice was incredible, and I don't think that kind of generation is going to come back soon. So I was with that kind of group of people, and finally staying in the city with that kind of conviction and antagonizing with the military dictatorship during that period of time was extremely risky. And so many peers, students in my age lost their lives, and most of them left the country, and I was one of them, to leave the country. Yeah.
I also want to mention the harsh prison life that you faced when you were in Somalia as an immigrant, or actually as an exile or prisoner of war, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yes. And that took 11 years of your life. But I don't want to mention the harsh life that you faced in prison. But as a result of your imprisonment or incarceration in Somalia prisons, you came out with your first book of poetry, Yet Now. I think roughly translated is Where Is It? Mm-hmm. Why was it necessary for you to publish that book at the time of your release? And I think it took several years of writing. It didn't happen at one moment, but how important is that book for you?
It was very important, primarily when I was in prison. That was the only outlet I had, I could say. So I was writing, of course, in hiding, because reading, writing, any kind of, thing, related to that was prohibited in the camp. So I used to hide my writings, in the, what do you call it, Yasar Bait, for the most part. And sometimes we lose it for rats or, other animals like that. But I wrote them in hiding, and it was a fresh reflection, very raw, of what I had been subjected to, but mostly what I had witnessed. So that was how I started, and this, as I mentioned, there is no, since it was restricted to read and write, there is no material, to write on. I used to use peelings of medicine packages that I collect, to write. So it was very important, primarily, as I mentioned, as an outlet. It helped me a lot. But it also documented, what was happening there on a daily basis. So upon my return, when the International Red Cross came to the camp to facilitate the repatriation process, they helped the materials that we produced in the camp and took them out because we're not supposed to take anything out of that camp. So that's how it was saved. But yes, it was a very difficult 10 years in which the whole world didn't know where we were, and we didn't have any communication with the outside world. But from the inside, I see there was a dichotomy in terms of my living and my experience there, because I had found people who are extremely selfless, and those people amongst us actually helped us to handle or to survive, that camp. On the other hand, of course, there was a great deal of brutality. So where do you land? Where is the midpoint between, those two extraordinary contradicting, lives? So that was something, to think about during that period of time. As much as it was brutal, in terms of the condition of life, the area which was completely endemic to malaria, schistosomiasis, etc., no nutrition, adequate, to sustain life fully. With all this tragedy, there were also times that we see glimpse of something different, usually coming through books smuggled, in the camp. So I remember reading Alex Haley's Roots in that camp, very tough book, as you know. And I remember reading The Survival in Auschwitz, Primo Levi's book. Those parallels were really something to think about life in general, and they gave me a broader, aspect of this connectedness that my experience had with the outside world, and that led to the works that I'm producing right now.
In your book of poetry and in your other writings, as you, and also with your artwork. You stated that you employed or incorporated wax and gold as in Kane literary format. What's your understanding of Kane, if I may ask, that you were able to use extensively in your artwork, and how useful has that been, or convenient has that been for you to express yourself?
I grew up in a church, a Sunday school, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So I was lucky enough, to get that education, because Kane is primarily used as in Ge'ez, which is considered a language of the clergy. So I studied Ge'ez, hoping that I would major in history maybe in the future, or I would major in language, so literature. So I studied it, and this is before the revolution. So I understood some aspect of Kane. I mean, nobody can, learn Kane at that age and understood the whole concept of it, but I had enough, to hold on to. So that duality of meaning, to me, you asked me what my understanding was. So it is, just to sum it up, if you have in mind a concept which is not going to be easy to talk about, for instance, especially in the context of Ethiopian politics or Ethiopian hierarchy, about several things. So people resorted to speaking in duality. So a concept might mean, something, and underneath there is going to be another concept that is going to mean differently. And those two concepts are going to develop hand in hand, and they would be tied by one keyword that would possess or that would have the meaning of both. So this is what Kane is in general. So in my work, number one, the idea of dealing with aesthetics, making things quote unquote beautiful or sublime, was confronted with the tragedy that I wanted to talk about. So how do you balance, the tragedy with, aesthetics or beauty? So that by itself has this dual nature, to it. So you can perceive it in that way. And all the layers, the transparency, the coloration that I mentioned earlier in my speech, all those are related to the concept of Kane.
The late Tsaggaye Gebremedehin, poet laureate of Ethiopia, wrote a blurb on your book of poetry, Yetno. And he wrote, this is my rough translation from the Amharic. Kabadech, in her youth, went through 11 years of incarceration in Somali prison and faced exile. Yet she withstood the suffering through the poetics of her illumined soul. She withstood the floods of gruesome prison life by floating above the intense suffering she was thrown into. And by doing so, she embraced the new love of the Somali people. She recounted the cultural bridge built between the Ethiopian and Somali people, but never sunk in despair. This to me is a monumental tribute to your personal character. What can you tell us about his remarks and the person?
Wow. Well, I idealized, him, and I grew up reading his poetry. And those of you who didn't know anything about Zakai Gabramattan, the late Zakai Gabramattan, he was a great poet that came with his own style that we call is Agaibet. That means the rhythm that he created became so influential, and a lot of a lot of people actually followed him. So I have that great admiration. And what can I say about his remark? I mean, this is phenomenal, and I feel so honored that he wrote this about my work. Thank you.
From June 13 to July 17 this year at the University of America Museum Project Space, you had a major exhibit of your artwork based on the general theme of blue and gray, this era of exile, in collaboration with my friend Ethelbert Miller, who is with us today, whom I knew when we both were working in Howard University, and Chris Beckett, the British poet and writer, who authored the first anthology of Ethiopian Amharic poetry in English, among others. Chris Beckett wrote, "Kabadech is the most interesting and respected of contemporary Amharic poets, but also the life story which lies behind her poems is urgent and astonishing." Ethelbert Miller likewise glorified your artistic ability and your ability in translation of poems from English to Amharic when he writes on blueness. You explained the cultural barriers that prevented certain concepts from direct translation and common understanding between cultures, as in exile, a person becomes alien to the new surrounding culture. Could you explain the nexus in your artwork, poetry, and sculpture, as well as translation, that assisted to transition to a better understanding of cultures, of humanity, including lessons drawn from such a collaboration with artists, writers, and poets?
Yes, wow, it's a tough question. I learned a lot, from the people you mentioned, and I had known Ethelbert for a long, long time. Before I saw his face, I used to know about him, and finally, we met. So this is over almost 30 years, I guess. Since then, he'd been, I don't know what to call him. I call him a mentor, but he's more than that. He's also a friend. Then he became a collaborator. I dedicated this poem to him during COVID-19 because he was one of the people who reached out, to many people, specifically to me, and he would be sending me information that he gets while everybody was in quarantine. So this is a kind of person that I got involved to collaborate with, and he's extremely knowledgeable and generous, so I learned a lot. The same thing with Chris Beckett when we started translation together, translating my poem. So he's the person who knows Amharic. So I learned a lot from Chris Beckett as well. So this final phase of my progress in the arts, trying to tie social issues, literature, and visual art together, it was challenging, but I grew up through the process, I would say.
I think we will close here, and you have been very wonderful, Professor Kabadech, and also you've been wonderful, audience. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.